What would you do if the walls you built to keep your family safe from the enemy became the very trap that sealed your fate with a killer you couldn't see? In 430 BC, the greatest democracy the world had ever known collapsed. Not under the swords of an invading army, but under a mysterious disease that erased 1/3 of an entire city's population. This is the story of how the Plague of Athens didn't just kill tens of thousands of people. It killed the soul of a civilization, destroyed its greatest leader, and changed the course of human history forever. And 25 centuries later, scientists still don't know exactly what it was. In the middle of the 5th century BC, Athens was, by almost any measure available to the ancient world, the most extraordinary city that had ever existed. It was the birthplace of democracy, a political system in which ordinary citizens, not kings or hereditary aristocrats, gathered in assembly to debate and vote on the decisions that governed their lives. It was the centre of philosophy, producing thinkers whose questions about ethics, knowledge, and the nature of reality would occupy human civilization for the next 2,500 years. It was an economic powerhouse, its silver mines at Laurion funding a navy that dominated the Aegean Sea, and a building program that produced the Parthenon, still standing today as one of the most recognizable achievements of human architecture. At the center of this golden age stood a man named Pericles, a statesman whose combination of political skill, military competence, and genuine vision for what Athens could become had made him, for nearly 3 decades, the most influential figure in Athenian public life. He was not a king. Athenian democracy had no formal position of supreme executive authority, but Pericles held elected military command year after year, and his persuasive power in the citizen assembly was such that the historian Thucydides, who lived through everything that follows in this story, described Athens under his leadership as being, in practice if not in name, ruled by its first citizen. Pericles had guided Athens through an extraordinary expansion of its power. The Delian League, originally formed as a defensive alliance of Greek city-states against the threat of Persian invasion, had gradually transformed under Athenian leadership into something closer to an empire, with the treasury of the alliance relocated to Athens itself, and allied states paying tribute that funded Athenian prosperity. This growth had not gone unnoticed by the other major power in the Greek world. Sparta was everything Athens was not. Where Athens was a maritime, commercial, culturally expansive democracy, Sparta was a militarized, insular, oligarchic society built around one of the most disciplined land armies the ancient world had ever produced. Spartan boys were removed from their families at the age of 7 to begin a brutal training regime called the agoge, designed to produce soldiers who would never break formation, never retreat, and never question orders. The result was a hoplite infantry force with a reputation for invincibility in open battle that no other Greek state could match. The tension between these two systems of power, Athenian and Spartan, democratic and oligarchic, naval and land-based, had been building for decades, punctuated by proxy conflicts and diplomatic crises that both sides managed to contain short of full-scale war. By 431 BC, that containment failed. The Peloponnesian War began, a conflict that would eventually draw in nearly every significant power in the Greek world and would not fully end for 27 years. Pericles, assessing the relative strengths of the two combatants with the strategic clarity that had defined his career, understood immediately that Athens could not defeat Sparta in the arena where Sparta was strongest. A pitched land battle between the Athenian hoplite levy and the professional Spartan war machine was a battle Athens would almost certainly lose. What Athens possessed instead was naval supremacy, a fleet of warships that no other Greek power could match, funded by the tribute of the Delian League and the silver of Laurion, and capable of projecting power and securing supply lines across the entire Aegean. The strategy Pericles proposed to the Athenian assembly was, on its surface, almost unbearably passive for a proud and martial Greek city-state. Athens would not meet Sparta in open battle. Instead, the rural population of Attica, the broader territory surrounding the city of Athens itself, would abandon their farms, their ancestral homes, and their agricultural land and relocate inside the fortified perimeter of Athens and its port at Piraeus. The two locations were connected by a pair of massive fortified corridors known as the Long Walls, stretching for several miles and creating a protected passage that meant Athens could never be cut off from the sea, no matter how completely Spartan forces controlled the surrounding countryside. The logic was elegant in its way. Let Sparta ravage the Attic farmland every summer campaigning season. The material loss would be painful but not fatal, since Athens could import grain by sea from its allies and colonies around the Black Sea and elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Athenian navy would harass Spartan coastal territories and allied cities, applying pressure that a land power without a comparable fleet had no effective way to counter. Over time, Pericles calculated, Sparta would exhaust itself against a strategy it had no answer for, while Athens preserved its core strength intact behind its walls and its ships. What this strategy required, though, was something that Pericles perhaps did not fully weigh in his calculations: an enormous concentration of human beings within a physical space that had never been designed to hold them. The population of Attica in this period is estimated by historians at somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, counting citizens, resident foreigners, women, children, and the enslaved population that formed a substantial part of Athenian society. A significant portion of this population, perhaps not all of it, since some outlying areas were harder to evacuate completely, but certainly the majority of the rural population within reach of Spartan raiding, was now compressed into the city of Athens and the corridor to Piraeus. The city that had been built, over generations, to house a certain population within its walls, now had to absorb refugees numbering in the tens of thousands beyond its normal capacity. People built makeshift shelters in every available space, in the gaps between buildings, along the base of the city walls, inside sacred precincts that had never been intended as residential areas. The pnyx, where the citizen assembly gathered to debate and vote, became surrounded by improvised housing. Even the open ground between the long walls themselves, that protected corridor to the sea, became crowded with people who had nowhere else to go. Sanitation infrastructure, which even in the best-run ancient cities was rudimentary by modern standards, was overwhelmed almost immediately. Water sources that had adequately served the normal population of Athens now had to serve several times that number. Waste disposal systems, never designed for this scale, failed to keep pace with what the crowded population was producing. The Athenians who had fled the countryside for safety inside the walls had, without anyone fully recognizing it in real time, created the exact conditions: density, poor sanitation, stressed populations living in close and constant proximity, that epidemic disease exploits most effectively. They had built themselves a refuge from Spartan spears. They had also built themselves a trap, and they did not yet know what was coming to spring it. While the Spartan army conducted its expected summer campaign in 430 BC, marching into Attica and beginning the systematic destruction of farmland, orchards, and vineyards that Pericles' strategy had accepted as an unavoidable cost, the citizens of Athens watched from behind their walls with a mixture of anger and grim confidence. They could see the smoke of their burning farms in the distance. They could not do anything about it without abandoning the naval strategy that was, in Pericles' assessment, their only path to eventual victory. What they believed, correctly for the moment, was that they were physically safe. The walls held. The Spartan army, lacking any tradition of siege warfare and lacking the engineering capability to breach Athenian fortifications, could not get in. They were safe from spears and arrows. They had no idea they were not safe from something else entirely. The most detailed and reliable account of what happened next comes from Thucydides, the Athenian historian and former military commander, who wrote what remains one of the most sophisticated works of historical analysis to survive from the ancient world. Thucydides was not simply reporting rumours or second-hand accounts. He contracted the disease himself and survived it, which gave him both direct personal knowledge of its symptoms and, crucially, the kind of dispassionate analytical distance that comes from having lived through an experience and emerged on the other side, able to describe it with clinical precision rather than panic. According to Thucydides, the disease had originated far to the south, in the region of Ethiopia, before moving north through Egypt and Libya and eventually reaching the wider Mediterranean world. The exact mechanism of its spread across this distance is not something Thucydides could fully document, but his account is specific about the point of entry into Athens, the port of Piraeus. Piraeus was, in ordinary times, one of the busiest commercial harbours in the ancient Mediterranean, a hub of trade routes connecting Athens to grain suppliers around the Black Sea, to allied cities throughout the Aegean, and to trading partners across the wider Mediterranean world, including Egypt. In the summer of 430 BC, with the Athenian population already swollen by refugees and dependent more than ever on maritime trade for food and supplies, the harbour was as active as ever, ships arriving and departing in the ordinary rhythm of ancient commerce. Somewhere among that ordinary traffic, a vessel arrived carrying something far more dangerous than any cargo listed on its manifest. Whether it was a sailor, a passenger, contaminated water stores, or infected rodents aboard the ship, the ancient sources do not specify the exact vector, and modern epidemiologists analysing the account can only speculate. The disease made landfall at Piraeus and began, quietly and without any immediate alarm, to move among the people of the port district. The initial spread would have been almost invisible against the ordinary background of illness that any large ancient population experienced. People got sick regularly, from 100 different causes, and a handful of unusual fevers in a busy port town would not, at first, have seemed like anything requiring particular alarm. This is one of the most important dynamics in the history of any epidemic disease, the period of quiet initial transmission before the pattern becomes undeniable, during which the disease has every opportunity to establish itself widely before anyone recognizes what is happening. By the time the pattern did become undeniable, the disease had already moved beyond the port district and into the densely packed city of Athens itself. And it was in the city, among the refugee population crowded into every available space behind the long walls, that the disease found conditions that were, from an epidemiological perspective, almost perfectly suited to its rapid transmission. The first Athenians to notice something was badly wrong were, naturally, ordinary citizens who watched their neighbours, family members, and fellow refugees fall suddenly and severely ill without any warning. Thucydides describes people in perfect health collapsing with symptoms so sudden and severe that there was no gradual transition from wellness to sickness. One day a person was functioning normally, and within a very short period, they were overwhelmed by the disease's onset. The immediate popular reaction, as it so often is in human history when a mysterious and deadly illness appears without explanation, was to seek a human cause rather than accept the terrifying reality of an invisible, non-human enemy. Rumours spread rapidly through the crowded city that Spartan agents had somehow infiltrated Athens and poisoned the wells and cisterns that supplied the city's water. This theory had a certain logic to it, in the sense that it offered something the population desperately needed, an explanation that involved human agency, human intention, and therefore at least the theoretical possibility of human countermeasures. If Spartan spies had poisoned the water, then finding and stopping those spies, or securing alternative water sources, offered a path to safety. The theory was wrong, and its wrongness became apparent with terrible speed. Poisoned wells, even if such a conspiracy had existed, could not explain the pattern of the disease's spread, the way it moved from the port district inward through the city, the way it struck people who had no connection to any particular water source, the way it continued to spread and intensify even as alternative water arrangements were made. What the Athenians were facing was not sabotage, it was an epidemic, moving through their compressed, refugee-swollen population with a speed and lethality that nothing in their collective experience had prepared them to understand or resist. By the time this reality became clear, and it became clear with agonizing speed as the numbers of sick and dying multiplied day by day, the disease had already established itself throughout the city. There was no longer any question of stopping it at the harbour or isolating it to a single district, or containing it through any measure available to a 5th century BC city-state with no concept of germ theory, no understanding of contagion mechanisms beyond the crudest observations, and no institutional capacity for the kind of coordinated public health response that later centuries would eventually develop. Athens was going to experience this disease in its full, uncontrolled force, and the city's own wartime strategy, the concentration of its population behind protective walls, had ensured that the experience would be as catastrophic as circumstances could possibly make it. What makes the account of the Plague of Athens uniquely valuable to historians and medical researchers alike, more than 2,000 years after the events it describes, is the extraordinary clinical precision with which Thucydides documented the progression of the disease through the human body. Thucydides was not a physician. He was a historian and former military commander, but he approached the task of describing the plague with the same rigorous, evidence-based methodology that characterizes his account of the war's military and political events. He states explicitly that he is recording the symptoms in such careful detail, specifically so that if the disease were ever to recur, people would be able to recognize it. This intention, to create a permanent, precise medical record for the benefit of future generations, is remarkable for its time and has made his account one of the most cited primary sources in the history of epidemiology. The onset, according to Thucydides, was abrupt and violent, with none of the gradual build-up that might allow a person to sense illness approaching and take precautions. A person in apparently perfect health would suddenly be struck by an intense fever, accompanied by severe headaches, so painful that Thucydides describes them as feeling as though the head itself were burning. The eyes became inflamed and bloodshot, taking on a reddish appearance that anyone observing the sick could recognize even at a distance. From this initial onset, the disease moved with terrible speed into the throat and mouth. The tongue and throat became blood red, and patients began coughing up blood and experiencing breath that carried an unusual and deeply unpleasant odour, a detail that Thucydides records with the specificity of someone who had smelled it himself and wanted his readers to understand exactly what they might encounter. Sneezing and hoarseness followed, and within a short time, the infection moved down into the chest, producing a severe cough that Thucydides describes in terms that suggest significant respiratory distress. The digestive system was assaulted next. Patients experienced violent vomiting, bringing up bile in every form that the ancient physicians had names for, accompanied by intensely painful convulsions that in some cases subsided afterward, and in others continued to torment the patient. The skin, meanwhile, underwent a transformation that must have been horrifying for family members and caregivers to witness. It developed a reddish, livid appearance and broke out in small pustules and ulcers across the entire body. Perhaps the most distinctive symptom Thucydides describes was the internal sensation of heat that patients reported, a burning so intense that they could not bear to have any clothing or covering touch their skin, and desperately wanted to throw themselves into cold water for relief. Some patients, driven to distraction by this internal fire, actually did throw themselves into wells and cisterns in a desperate, uncontrolled attempt to cool the burning sensation consuming them from within. A detail that speaks to the sheer intensity of suffering the disease produced, intensity severe enough to override every ordinary instinct for self-preservation and rational behaviour. The disease brought with it a particular cruelty in the way it disrupted the most basic biological functions that the body relies on for recovery. Patients suffered from an unquenchable thirst that no amount of water could satisfy, leaving them in a state of constant, desperate craving even as they consumed liquid. At the same time, they were tormented by an inability to sleep, regardless of how exhausted and depleted their bodies became. The combination of relentless thirst and complete sleeplessness, layered on top of fever, pain, and the body's general assault by the disease, created a state of suffering that persisted around the clock, with no respite. What struck Thucydides as particularly notable, and what modern medical historians still find significant in his account, was that the human body did not simply collapse quickly under this assault. Despite the severity and violence of the symptoms, the disease did not kill with immediate speed in most cases. Instead, the body proved remarkably resilient in the early stages, resisting the disease's progression for a period before finally succumbing. Most of those who died, according to Thucydides' observation, did not die immediately, but rather perished around the 7th or 9th day of the illness, at which point the internal heat that had been consuming them apparently reached a point where it destroyed vital organs and the body could no longer sustain the fight. For those who managed to survive past this critical period, and Thucydides is clear that not everyone died at this point, that a substantial number of patients did push through the most acute phase of the disease, a second wave of suffering often awaited them. The disease frequently descended into the bowels at this stage, producing severe diarrhea and further weakening a body that had already been devastated by more than a week of continuous assault. Many who had survived the initial fever and internal burning ultimately succumbed during this secondary intestinal phase, their bodies too depleted by the preceding ordeal to withstand this additional insult. The disease also produced a particular category of survivors whose suffering, while not fatal, left permanent and visible marks that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Some patients lost their sight entirely, the disease apparently damaging the eyes so severely during the acute phase that vision never returned. Others experienced necrosis in their extremities, the disease attacking the fingers, toes, and in some documented cases, the genitals, with tissue damage severe enough that amputation became the only way to prevent the spreading necrosis from killing the patient outright. Athenians who survived the epidemic but emerged missing fingers, toes, or eyesight became a visible, permanent reminder of what the city had endured, walking testimony to a catastrophe that could not simply be buried and forgotten once the immediate crisis passed. Perhaps strangest of all the documented effects was a phenomenon of complete memory loss that afflicted some survivors. Thucydides records that certain patients who recovered emerged with total amnesia, unable to recognize their own identity or the people closest to them, family, friends, the entire fabric of personal relationships that had constituted their life before the illness struck. They had physically survived, but the person who had contracted the disease was, for these survivors, gone. There is a particular kind of horror in prolonged suffering that ends in death only after the body has been forced through every possible stage of torment. The extended timeline of the illness, that 7 to 9 day span before the crisis point, and the additional suffering that could follow for those who survived that initial period, meant that for the people of Athens, watching a loved one die of the plague was not a brief and merciful process. It was an extended vigil of watching someone they cared about pass through stage after stage of physical torment, with no way to intervene, no medicine that helped, and no certainty about the outcome until the disease itself decided the question. The unquenchable thirst that Thucydides describes illustrates how completely this disease disrupted the normal relationship between a sick body and the substances that should have provided relief. No matter how much water a patient consumed, the thirst did not diminish. Caregivers found themselves bringing water again and again to patients who drank without any apparent benefit. The sleeplessness compounded this cruelty. A body under sustained biological assault desperately needs rest to marshal whatever resources it has toward recovery. The plague seemed to specifically deny its victims this tool, keeping them exhausted and awake even as their bodies became more depleted by fever, internal burning, vomiting, and pain. What makes Thucydides' account so striking is his insistence on describing exactly how the body resisted before finally being overwhelmed. Despite the ferocity of the initial symptoms, the human body did not immediately collapse. There was a period, often several days, during which the person continued to exist in this state of extreme suffering without either recovering or dying, simply enduring. This was not a disease that killed quickly and mercifully. It put its victims through an extended ordeal before the outcome was finally determined. For those whose bodies finally succumbed around the 7th or 9th day, Thucydides attributes the death to the internal heat that had been building throughout the illness, eventually destroying the vital organs necessary for survival. The survivors who made it past this critical juncture were not necessarily safe. The disease frequently moved into a second devastating phase, descending into the intestines and producing severe diarrhea that further weakened bodies already pushed to their absolute limits. Many who had endured the initial fever, the burning, and the sleeplessness, who had begun to hope they might survive, found themselves facing this additional assault precisely when they had the least remaining capacity to withstand it. For those who did survive completely, the physical toll often remained permanently visible. The loss of fingers, toes, and in documented cases genitalia to necrosis meant that Athens, in the years following the epidemic, contained a substantial population of survivors bearing permanent physical evidence of what they had endured. People who had to relearn how to grip tools, how to walk, how to perform the most basic tasks of daily life. The blindness that afflicted other survivors meant a population of Athenians who had to navigate the rest of their lives without sight, in a city with no institutional support for the disabled beyond whatever family networks remained intact after the epidemic had finished tearing through the population. For a society organized as fundamentally around family and lineage as ancient Athens was, the amnesia that afflicted some survivors represents a form of loss that is difficult to fully comprehend even now. Survival purchased at the cost of everything that had made a person who they were before the disease took hold of them. Ancient Greek medicine, at the time the plague struck Athens, was not the primitive or superstitious practice that modern people sometimes assume when thinking about pre-scientific eras. Athens in the 5th century BC was home to some of the most sophisticated medical thinking the ancient world had produced, existing alongside, and sometimes overlapping, with the emerging Hippocratic tradition that would, in the following decades, produce written medical texts attempting to explain disease through natural causes rather than divine punishment or magical affliction. Athenian physicians had accumulated genuine practical knowledge through observation and experience, treating wounds, setting bones, managing childbirth complications, and addressing a wide range of ordinary illnesses with techniques that, while primitive by modern standards, represented real accumulated expertise. None of this expertise proved to be of any use whatsoever against the plague. Thucydides is explicit and unflinching in his account of medicine's total failure in the face of this epidemic. The physicians of Athens, applying every treatment and technique available to them, found that nothing worked. Remedies that had proven effective against other illnesses provided no benefit against this disease. In fact, Thucydides records something even more disturbing than simple ineffectiveness. Treatments that seemed to help one patient sometimes proved actively harmful to another, meaning that physicians could not even rely on consistent patterns of what might provide relief. The disease behaved unpredictably from patient to patient in ways that made any systematic medical response essentially impossible. This medical failure had a particularly bitter irony built into it. The physicians of Athens, precisely because they were the people most directly and repeatedly exposed to plague patients through their professional duty to treat the sick, suffered disproportionately high mortality rates compared to the general population. The very expertise and social role that should have positioned them to help became, in the context of this specific epidemic, a source of extreme personal danger. Physicians who approached the bedsides of the sick, who examined symptoms up close, who spent extended time in the presence of those most heavily afflicted by the disease, were exposing themselves to whatever transmission mechanism the plague relied upon far more intensively than ordinary citizens who might have some opportunity to limit their contact with the sick. The result was a medical profession that was, quite literally, being decimated by the very disease it was attempting to treat, without ever developing an understanding of what that disease actually was or how it spread. Athens found itself losing a substantial portion of its medical expertise at precisely the moment when that expertise was most desperately needed, creating a vicious cycle in which the capacity to respond to the epidemic diminished even as the epidemic itself continued to rage. Beyond the failure of formal medicine, the epidemic revealed something even more devastating about the ordinary human bonds that societies depend upon in times of crisis. The simple act of caring for a sick family member became, under these particular circumstances, a mechanism for spreading death rather than preventing it. Parents who nursed sick children, children who tended to ailing parents, spouses who cared for each other through the course of the illness. All of these ordinary, expected acts of familial devotion became vectors for transmission, meaning that the compassion and loyalty that should have provided comfort and support instead frequently resulted in entire households being consumed by the disease, one member after another. This dynamic created an agonizing dilemma that Thucydides describes with clear-eyed honesty. Those who withdrew from caring for the sick, who abandoned even their closest family members out of fear of contagion, often survived, while those who remained loyal and continued to provide care frequently paid for that loyalty with their own lives. The epidemic was, in this sense, actively punishing exactly the behaviours that Athenian society and most human societies generally consider most virtuous: loyalty, compassion, willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the well-being of loved ones, while rewarding exactly the behaviours that societies generally consider shameful, namely abandonment of the sick and prioritisation of personal survival above familial duty. The disease's reach extended beyond the human population as well. Thucydides notes that scavenging animals, dogs and birds of prey that would ordinarily consume the flesh of unburied corpses, themselves sickened and died after feeding on plague victims. This gave the ancient Athenians visceral evidence that whatever was killing them could be transmitted through contact with the dead, even without any theoretical framework for contagion. It also removed one of the ordinary mechanisms by which ancient cities managed the disposal of the dead, since even the scavengers were dying from contact with the corpses. The psychological impact of watching every conventional response fail — medical treatment, familial care, even the natural scavenging processes that ordinarily helped manage mortality — cannot be overstated. There was no accumulated wisdom that applied, no elder whose guidance helped, no physician whose expertise mattered, no pattern of behaviour that reliably protected anyone. In Athens during the plague, doing everything right offered no protection whatsoever. This realisation, more than the raw mortality numbers, is what began to fracture the social fabric of the city. Households where every member had died became a common and haunting sight throughout the crowded city. Buildings that had recently held entire families now standing silent and empty. The scale of this domestic devastation, multiplied across thousands of homes, represented a systematic unravelling of the family structures that had organised Athenian society for generations. As the death toll mounted through the summer and into the following months, the practical mechanisms that any society relies upon to manage mortality began to break down entirely. And this breakdown revealed something troubling about how quickly the structures of civilization can dissolve when the scale of crisis exceeds what those structures were designed to handle. Ancient Athenian burial customs were elaborate and deeply meaningful, involving specific rituals, prescribed periods of mourning, and considerable social investment in ensuring that the dead received proper treatment befitting their status and their family's honour. These customs assumed a certain manageable rate of death, a pace at which families could devote appropriate time and resources to each individual loss. The plague shattered this assumption completely. Bodies began accumulating faster than proper burial rites could be performed, and Thucydides describes corpses piling up in the streets, in public spaces, and around the sources of water that the crowded refugee population depended upon for survival. This is a detail worth sitting with. The dead were not simply being neglected in some peripheral or hidden way, but were visibly present throughout the daily life of the city, a constant and inescapable reminder of the epidemic's toll that every surviving Athenian had to navigate around, simply to go about whatever remained of ordinary existence. The traditional funeral customs that had governed Athenian society for generations were, out of sheer practical necessity, abandoned. Thucydides describes a particularly striking breakdown in normal social order. People began seizing opportunities to cremate their own dead, using funeral pyres that other families had already prepared and lit for their own deceased relatives, essentially stealing burial resources from one another in the desperate scramble to dispose of bodies before the summer heat made the situation even more unbearable. This detail illustrates how completely the ordinary courtesies and social contracts that govern behavior even in times of stress had disintegrated under the pressure of mass mortality that exceeded any capacity the city had to manage it through normal means. Sacred spaces, which under ordinary circumstances would have been scrupulously protected from any contamination by death, were overrun by desperate people seeking divine intervention and dying within the very precincts where they had gone to pray for salvation. Temples that were meant to represent the connection between the mortal and divine realms became instead sites where corpses accumulated among the altars and statues, a jarring and deeply unsettling inversion of everything these spaces were supposed to represent in Athenian religious life. Beyond the practical breakdown in burial customs, something more fundamental was happening to the social and legal order of the city. Thucydides observes that the normal constraints that govern human behavior in a functioning society, fear of legal punishment, concern for social reputation, respect for religious prohibition, lost their power over people who had come to believe, with considerable justification, given what they were witnessing daily, that they might well be dead within days, regardless of how they conducted themselves in the meantime. This psychological shift had profound consequences for how Athenians behaved toward one another and toward the institutions that ordinarily regulated their society. Crime increased visibly and openly, without the usual attempts at concealment that criminals typically employ to avoid detection and punishment. Why bother hiding wrongdoing from authorities and courts that might never actually get the chance to prosecute you, given the very real possibility that you, the wrongdoer, might succumb to the plague before any legal consequences could ever be applied? This logic, however grim, spread through the population and manifested in a visible breakdown of the ordinary rule of law that had characterized Athenian civic life. The economic and social hierarchy of the city also underwent rapid disruption. Wealthy families were dying at high rates, resulting in sudden transfers of property and inheritance. Thucydides notes that people who had previously been poor suddenly found themselves wealthy, having inherited property from relatives killed by the epidemic, creating a chaotic redistribution of resources that would have been unthinkable under normal conditions. A particular kind of hedonism emerged from this environment. With death seeming so arbitrary and impossible to guard against through any precaution, many Athenians concluded there was little point in the ordinary self-restraint and long-term planning that governs behavior in stable societies. If wealth could not buy protection and virtuous behavior offered no more safety than vice, the rational response for a significant portion of the population became pursuing immediate pleasure while the opportunity still existed. This is one of the most psychologically astute passages in Thucydides' account, because it captures something that later epidemics would demonstrate again and again. Mass mortality events do not simply kill people, they fundamentally alter the psychological and social calculus by which surviving populations organize their behavior. The Athens that emerged from even the early stages of the plague was, in important ways, a different society than the one that had existed before. Religion occupied a central and pervasive position in the life of ancient Athens, woven into virtually every aspect of civic, family, and personal existence in ways that are difficult for modern secular societies to fully appreciate. The gods were not abstract concepts confined to occasional ceremony, but were understood to be active participants in daily life, capable of intervention, worthy of continuous propitiation, and responsible for both the blessings and misfortunes that befell individuals and the city as a whole. When catastrophe struck, the instinctive and deeply ingrained response of an Athenian citizen was to turn to religious practice. Prayer, sacrifice, consultation of oracles and prophecies, seeking either explanation for the calamity or some means of appeasing whatever divine displeasure might have caused it. The plague tested this religious framework to its absolute limit, and in the judgment of Thucydides, and, evidently, of a significant portion of the Athenian population who lived through the experience, the framework ultimately failed to provide either comfort or practical benefit. People turned to prayer and sacrifice in the early stages of the epidemic with the same fervour and expectation that had characterized Athenian religious practice through generations of previous crises. What they discovered, as the epidemic continued to rage, regardless of how devoutly they prayed or how many sacrifices they offered, was that these traditional religious responses appeared to make no discernible difference to the disease's progression through the population. Prophecies and oracular pronouncements, which had always occupied a significant place in how Greek society understood and interpreted major events, took on particular significance during the epidemic. Thucydides records that older Athenians recalled an ancient prophecy stating that a war involving the Dorian peoples, the ethnic and cultural group to which the Spartans belonged, would be accompanied by a great plague or period of dying. This prophecy, whether genuinely ancient or a piece of folklore that gained new significance in retrospect once the epidemic struck during a war against Sparta, became a subject of considerable debate and discussion among Athenians trying to make sense of what was happening to them. There was even debate about the precise wording of this ancient prophecy, with some Athenians arguing about whether the original text had actually referred to a plague or dearth of some kind, or a famine, the ancient Greek words for these concepts being similar enough that the distinction became a matter of genuine scholarly and popular dispute during the crisis itself, as people searched desperately through whatever fragments of prophetic tradition they could recall for some framework that might explain their present suffering, and perhaps offer guidance about how it might end. Some Athenians developed a specific theological interpretation of events that placed the god Apollo, associated in Greek religious tradition with both healing and the sending of plague and pestilence, on the side of Sparta in the ongoing conflict. This interpretation drew on the memory that the Spartans, before the war began, had consulted the oracle at Delphi, Apollo's most important sanctuary, and had reportedly received encouragement for their cause. If Apollo favoured Sparta, the logic ran, then perhaps this plague represented the god's direct intervention on Sparta's behalf, a divine weapon being wielded against Athens in support of the Spartan war effort. This interpretation, whatever its theological merit, at least provided some kind of coherent explanatory framework for events that otherwise seemed to defy any rational understanding available to the ancient Athenians. What is perhaps most significant about the religious dimension of the plague, from a historical and psychological perspective, is not simply that people turned to religious explanation in the face of catastrophe. This was an entirely predictable and unremarkable response, given the religious framework within which Athenian society operated, but rather what happened to religious faith and practice as the epidemic continued, and religious responses continued to prove ineffective at halting or explaining the disease's progression. Thucydides describes a genuine crisis of faith spreading through significant portions of the Athenian population, driven by a very simple and devastating observation. The plague appeared to kill without any discernible relationship to piety or moral virtue. People who had faithfully observed every religious obligation, who had lived according to accepted standards of moral behaviour, who had shown proper reverence for the gods throughout their lives, died from the disease at rates that seemed no different from those who had been careless, or even actively impious in their religious observance. If the gods were indeed responsible for the plague, and if religious devotion and moral behaviour ordinarily merited divine protection or favour, then the evident randomness of who lived and who died posed a profound theological problem that traditional Athenian religious understanding had no ready answer for. This observation led many Athenians to a conclusion Thucydides records with characteristic directness. Since the gods appeared unwilling or unable to protect the pious any more effectively than the impious, many people concluded there was little practical value in continuing to observe religious obligations meant to secure divine favour. If honouring the gods provided no measurable benefit, the entire structure of religious and moral incentive that had governed Athenian behaviour began to lose its persuasive force. Amid this widespread breakdown, Thucydides identifies one group whose behaviour stood in marked contrast to the general pattern: those who had already contracted the plague and survived it. These survivors, having developed what modern medicine would recognise as acquired immunity, proved willing to nurse the currently sick with a compassion that Thucydides specifically praises, precisely because they alone could approach the dying without the same mortal fear that kept so many others away. Their example stands as one of the few genuinely admirable threads running through an otherwise devastating portrait of social and moral collapse. Pericles had led Athens through nearly 3 decades of political dominance, built on a foundation of consistent success, careful strategic judgment, and an ability to persuade the Athenian citizen assembly to follow policies that he believed served the city's long-term interests, even when those policies required patience and sacrifice that a less skilled politician might never have been able to secure popular support for. His strategy for the Peloponnesian War, however painful its immediate consequences for the rural population forced to abandon their homes and watch their farmland destroyed, had been based on a coherent and defensible logic about how Athens could ultimately prevail against Spartan land power through sustained naval pressure and economic endurance. The plague destroyed this careful political equilibrium with devastating speed. As mortality mounted throughout the crowded city, and as the suffering of the refugee population compressed behind the long walls became increasingly severe and increasingly obviously connected to the strategic decision that had brought them there in the first place, popular anger began to focus with intense and specific force on the man whose policy had, in the eyes of many suffering Athenians, directly created the conditions that allowed the epidemic to spread with such devastating efficiency. The logic, however unfair in retrospect, given that no one could have anticipated the epidemic when the original strategic decision was made, was not entirely without merit. Pericles had specifically ordered the mass evacuation of the countryside into the city, creating precisely the crowded and unsanitary conditions that had proven so catastrophically conducive to the disease's spread. Thucydides describes the emotional state of the Athenian population during this period with considerable psychological insight, noting that people in extreme distress and suffering naturally seek someone to blame, some concrete target for anger and frustration that can never be adequately directed at an invisible disease that offers no human face against which grief and rage can be productively channeled. Pericles, as the architect of the strategy that had brought the rural population into the city, became that target, absorbing years of accumulated resentment and blame that might, under less catastrophic circumstances, never have coalesced into open political opposition against a leader who had otherwise commanded remarkably durable popular support throughout his long career. Pericles responded to this mounting political crisis in the manner that had characterized his entire political career. He stood before the citizen assembly and delivered what Thucydides records as a powerful and carefully reasoned speech, defending his strategic judgment, acknowledging the genuine suffering the population had experienced, but arguing forcefully that abandoning the fundamental approach to the war at this point would squander everything Athens had already sacrificed, and would leave the city in an even worse strategic position than continuing to follow the original plan. It was, by any reasonable historical assessment, a demonstration of genuine political courage. Standing before an angry, grieving, frightened population and making the case for continued patience and sacrifice, rather than simply telling them what they wanted to hear in order to preserve his own political position. The speech, however eloquent and however sound its underlying logic, could not overcome the raw emotional force of a population that had watched loved ones die in agonizing numbers and desperately needed someone to hold accountable for that suffering. The Athenian assembly, in a move that illustrates both the genuine democratic accountability built into Athenian political institutions and the sometimes counterproductive volatility that such direct democratic accountability could produce during moments of crisis, voted to remove Pericles from his military command and imposed a substantial financial penalty against him, a formal repudiation of the leadership that had guided the city for nearly 3 decades. This political humiliation, severe as it was for a man who had held such consistent influence over Athenian public life for so long, was compounded almost immediately by a personal tragedy that struck at the very core of Pericles' private existence. The plague, indifferent to status, wealth, or political power, in exactly the way that had already shattered so many Athenians' assumptions about divine justice and moral order, entered Pericles' own household and claimed both his sister and, devastatingly, both of his legitimate sons, the children who would have carried forward his family line and his citizenship status under Athenian law, which required legitimate Athenian parentage on both sides for full citizenship rights. Thucydides, along with other ancient sources describing this period, records that Pericles, a man renowned throughout his public career for maintaining stoic composure and rational self-control, even under the most difficult political and military circumstances, was observed weeping openly and uncontrollably as he placed a funeral wreath upon the body of his last surviving legitimate son. This image of the great statesman whose entire public persona had been built around calm, rational leadership, finally breaking down completely under the weight of personal grief, compounding professional humiliation, represents one of the most poignant moments in the entire historical record of the plague and its consequences. The political and personal devastation Pericles experienced illustrates how the plague's impact extended far beyond mortality statistics to reshape the leadership and decision-making capacity of the city at precisely the moment steady leadership was most desperately needed. Athens eventually restored Pericles to his position, but only after significant damage had already been done during the crucial early period of the war. The restoration proved tragically brief. In the autumn of 429 BC, having survived the initial wave that had already claimed his sister and his sons, Pericles himself finally succumbed to the plague. The man whose strategic vision had shaped Athenian policy for nearly 3 decades, whose building programs had created some of the most enduring architectural achievements in human history, died from the same disease that had already devastated the population he led. Athens was left, at one of the most critical junctures in its history, without the leadership that had provided consistency through decades of challenge. The initial devastating wave of the plague that struck Athens in the summer of 430 BC did not represent the epidemic's complete course. After the terrible intensity of that first outbreak, the disease's grip on the city gradually loosened through 429 BC, and by some point in that year, the immediate crisis appeared to be subsiding, offering the traumatized population what must have felt like a desperately needed reprieve from the relentless mortality that had consumed the preceding months. This respite proved to be temporary and deceptive. The disease returned with renewed force in a second major wave that struck Athens between 427 and 426 BC, catching a population that had perhaps begun to hope the worst was permanently behind them, and forcing them to endure another extended period of the same horrific symptoms, the same overwhelmed medical response, and the same social and psychological devastation that had characterized the initial outbreak. This recurrence illustrates a pattern that epidemiologists studying later historical epidemics would recognize as common to many major disease outbreaks throughout history. Initial waves of infection, followed by periods of apparent decline that proved to be temporary lulls rather than genuine resolution, with the disease returning to claim additional victims once conditions again became favorable for its transmission, or once a sufficient population of previously unexposed individuals had accumulated to sustain renewed spread. The military dimensions of this second wave proved particularly costly to Athenian strategic interests in ways that extended well beyond the immediate mortality within the city itself. Athenian naval forces, essential to the maritime strategy that Pericles had originally designed, and that Athens continued to pursue even after his death, carried the disease with them as they deployed to various military engagements and operations throughout the Aegean and beyond. Ships that had been dispatched to project Athenian power and pursue the war effort instead became vectors for spreading the epidemic to new locations, while simultaneously suffering catastrophic losses among their own crews and embarked soldiers from the very disease they were unwittingly transporting. Thucydides specifically records military expeditions during this period in which Athenian forces suffered devastating casualties from the plague before ever engaging in actual combat with enemy forces, a bitter and strategically significant irony that meant Athens was losing substantial numbers of trained soldiers and sailors to disease rather than to the military conflict these forces had actually been raised and deployed to fight. This pattern represented a particularly cruel form of strategic disadvantage. Athens' very attempt to prosecute the war effectively, deploying its naval assets in pursuit of the broader strategic objectives that Pericles had originally articulated, actually accelerated the spread and impact of the disease that was simultaneously undermining the city's capacity to sustain that same war effort. The cumulative demographic impact of both waves of the epidemic, when historians attempt to calculate it from the available evidence, represents one of the most catastrophic population losses that any major ancient civilization is documented to have experienced within such a compressed timeframe. Modern historical demographic analysis, working from the fragmentary but still valuable data available in ancient sources, including Thucydides' own observations, along with other contemporary and near-contemporary accounts, suggests that total mortality from the plague across both major waves likely fell somewhere in the range of 75,000 to 100,000 deaths. To understand the true significance of these numbers, they must be considered in proportion to the total population of Attica during this period, which historians estimate at somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, when accounting for citizens, resident foreigners, women, children, and the substantial enslaved population that formed part of Athenian society. A death toll in the range that the evidence suggests would therefore represent approximately 1/3 of the entire population of the region, an almost incomprehensible level of mortality that fundamentally altered every dimension of Athenian society, economy, and military capacity going forward. This demographic catastrophe had immediate and severe practical consequences for Athens' ability to continue prosecuting the war against Sparta on anything like the terms that had originally seemed favourable when Pericles first designed his strategic approach. The city's military manpower, both for its land forces and for the rowers and sailors who crewed its formidable navy, had been decimated alongside the general civilian population, meaning that Athens found itself increasingly hard-pressed to maintain the military capacity that its original strategic calculations had assumed would remain available throughout an extended conflict. The economic productivity of the city, already strained by the wartime disruption to agricultural production in the surrounding countryside, suffered further from the loss of such a substantial portion of the working population to disease. There is a striking and somewhat paradoxical detail regarding the plague's broader strategic impact. The very horror of the disease appears to have provided Athens with a form of unexpected protection. Spartan forces, despite continuing their traditional summer campaigns of ravaging the Attic countryside, proved unwilling to press their advantage by breaching the walls and entering Athens itself, precisely because the visible evidence of the epidemic, smoke rising continuously from funeral pyres, reports of devastating mortality, made Spartan commanders deeply reluctant to expose their own forces to contagion, even though Athens' military weakness during this period might otherwise have presented a favourable opportunity for a decisive assault. This illustrates one of the more counterintuitive aspects of how epidemic disease can shape military outcomes. The same catastrophic mortality devastating Athens from within simultaneously created a protective barrier against external threat. Sparta's formidable hoplite infantry, capable of overwhelming most conventional opposition, proved useless against an enemy Spartan soldiers could not fight with spears and shields, and Spartan commanders judged that the risk of exposure outweighed whatever benefit might come from pressing their advantage against a weakened Athens. The death of Pericles in the autumn of 429 BC created a leadership vacuum in Athenian politics that would prove impossible to adequately fill during the remaining decades of the Peloponnesian War, and the political consequences of this vacuum, emerging directly from the plague's most consequential single casualty, would ultimately shape the trajectory of Athenian history for the remainder of the conflict and beyond. Pericles had combined genuine strategic vision with sufficient personal authority and political skill to persuade the Athenian citizen assembly to accept difficult, patient, long-term strategies, even when those strategies required accepting short-term suffering and sacrifice in service of longer-term objectives. The political leaders who emerged to fill the vacuum left by his death, most prominently figures like Cleon, who represented a more populist and aggressive style of political leadership, lacked both the strategic patience and the sophisticated long-term vision that had characterized Pericles' approach to the war. These successor leaders tended to favor more immediately gratifying, but ultimately more reckless military and political policies, pursuing aggressive campaigns and confrontational strategies that played well with an Athenian citizen population still traumatized by the plague and eager for the kind of decisive, visible action that might feel more emotionally satisfying than the patient, defensive strategic approach Pericles had originally championed, even though that patient approach had arguably represented Athens' soundest path toward eventual strategic success against Sparta. The cumulative effect of this shift in political leadership and strategic direction, compounded by the ongoing demographic and economic damage the plague had inflicted on Athenian society, proved to have devastating long-term consequences for the city's fortunes in the broader war. Athens' military manpower, both for its army and for the navy, that had always represented its most distinctive strategic asset, never fully recovered from the population losses the epidemic had inflicted. The financial resources that had funded Pericles' ambitious building programs and had sustained Athens' capacity to wage extended naval warfare came under increasing strain as the war continued without the demographic and economic base that had originally made Athenian strategic ambitions plausible. Historians studying the Peloponnesian War have consistently identified the plague as representing a genuine turning point in the conflict's overall trajectory, even though the war itself would continue for more than 2 additional decades after the epidemic's worst ravages had subsided. The Athens that emerged from the plague years was fundamentally weaker in demographic terms, in economic terms, and crucially, in terms of the quality and consistency of its political leadership, than the Athens that had entered the war under Pericles' careful strategic guidance. This weakened position would prove decisive in shaping the war's ultimate outcome, as Athens found itself increasingly unable to sustain the kind of patient, long-term strategic approach that might have allowed it to prevail against Spartan land power through the naval and economic pressure that Pericles had originally envisioned as the path to eventual Athenian success. The war that had begun in 431 BC, and that the plague had so catastrophically disrupted in its earliest years, finally concluded in 404 BC, with Athens' complete and humiliating defeat, forced to accept terms that stripped away its empire, dismantled its formidable navy, and effectively ended the period of Athenian dominance over Greek political and military affairs that had characterized the preceding century. While it would be an oversimplification to attribute this ultimate outcome solely to the plague and its consequences, given the many additional military, political, and strategic factors that shaped the war's course over its full 27-year duration, historians broadly agree that the epidemic represented a genuine and significant turning point, weakening Athens at a critical early juncture in ways from which the city never fully recovered, even as the broader conflict continued to unfold across subsequent decades. Thucydides' account of the plague, preserved as part of his broader history of the Peloponnesian War, has endured for nearly 2,500 years as one of the most valuable primary sources available to historians studying both the specific events of ancient Athens and the broader phenomenon of how epidemic disease impacts human societies. His methodological approach, combining careful clinical observation of symptoms with sophisticated analysis of the social, political, and psychological consequences that mass mortality produced within a specific historical and cultural context, established an analytical framework that scholars studying later epidemics throughout human history have repeatedly drawn upon and referenced. The precise identity of the disease that Thucydides described has remained a subject of genuine scientific and historical debate that continues into the 21st century, with researchers proposing numerous candidate diseases based on careful analysis of the symptoms Thucydides documented. Typhus, smallpox, bubonic plague, measles, and even diseases with clinical presentations similar to modern hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola have all been proposed by different researchers analysing the ancient account. Each candidate disease matching some elements of Thucydides' detailed clinical description, while failing to fully account for other specific symptoms he recorded. Archaeological investigations, including analysis of dental pulp extracted from what are believed to be plague victim burial sites discovered in Athens, have added additional evidence to this ongoing scientific debate, without producing a definitive, universally accepted conclusion about the pathogen responsible for the epidemic. This enduring scientific uncertainty is, in its own way, a fitting testament to how completely the disease defied the understanding of everyone who encountered it, from the ancient Athenian physicians powerless against symptoms matching nothing in their accumulated knowledge, to modern researchers equipped with the full analytical apparatus of contemporary epidemiology, who still cannot conclusively identify the pathogen responsible. The deeper lesson the Plague of Athens offers, transcending the specific details of ancient Greek politics, concerns something more universal about civilizational vulnerability. Athens, at the height of its power, possessing the most advanced political institutions and formidable military capacity in the Greek world, discovered that none of these achievements provided any protection against an invisible biological threat that defied every tool the city could bring to bear. The greatest empire of its age was not brought to its knees by a rival army, but by a microscopic pathogen that exploited the very strategic decisions Athens had made to protect itself, transforming a fortress designed for safety into a trap perfectly suited to catastrophic disease transmission. This history stands as an enduring reminder that the threats capable of altering the trajectory of human civilization do not always announce themselves as armies at the gates. Sometimes the most consequential enemy a society will ever face is one that cannot be seen, cannot be negotiated with, and cannot be defeated through courage, wealth, or any conventional instrument of power. The plague that struck Athens in 430 BC killed tens of thousands, claimed one of history's most consequential leaders, and altered the course of a war that reshaped the ancient Greek world. But its most enduring legacy is the sobering lesson it still offers, 25 centuries later, about just how vulnerable even the most sophisticated societies remain to threats that no wall, no army, and no accumulated wisdom can fully guard against.